Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Lynn, and in today's flip video I'll be crafting with the Spellbinders January 2023 club kits. Here's a quick recap of the cards that I'll be making in this video, and as always I'll have at least one flat, one layered, one interactive, and one pop-up card. If you're short on time and you can't watch the full video, I will timestamp this video, so if you want to see me make a particular card, you can hover over the timeline and jump straight to just that card. Let's make this. Okay, so I'm gonna start with my flat card, and in fact, I'll have two flat cards to share today. This first one is going to feature the clear stamp of the month, and you do get the option if you want the coordinating dies that go along with it to get the clear stamp and dies together, but if you don't need the dies, then you can always just get the stamp by itself. And this large floral stamp is gorgeous. My panel here is a smidge larger than USA 2, so you can see just how prominent, how large this really is. And I'm gonna stamp onto some watercolor cardstock because I'll be coloring with my water-based markers, and so I'm stamping with VersaFine Clear Pinecone ink. This is a pigment ink, which is great if you're gonna color with something that is water-based. And this cardstock, most watercolor papers are textured, but this one is like super textured, and you'll see when I give you a close-up during the recap at the end. And as well, you can always check out my Instagram and my Facebook page, both as LV Handcrafted, and you'll see those close-up photos of it. But I'm coloring with Ohuhu water-based brush markers. They're really great. They have really nice real brush tip. I'm not coloring direct to paper though, because I'm going for a very monochromatic look, and I really want to control how much ink versus how much water I'm using, because I'm using the water to dilute the color down. And if you want to go direct to paper, you definitely could. It's just my preference is to scribble the color onto my acrylic block, which I'm using as something of a paint palette too, because I've scribbled out multiple different colors, and I'm just mixing them together so that even though I'm going for a monochromatic look, I'm still using different shades of brown just so that I can have some differences so that you can actually read the flowers, and they're set apart a little bit from the other foliage. So I'm basically just going over, because this is a nice watercolor paper, I can just go over the same areas and not have to worry too much about the cardstock getting soggy or pilling or anything like that. Watercolor paper is fantastic for that. It's designed to really take in a lot of color. And so I am bouncing around from sort of dry areas to get a little bit of color down, and then letting that first layer of color dry a little bit at least before I add more color to it. And mostly that is so that the color sets a little bit and I don't continue to kind of pull the color out. That way I'm layering color as opposed to moving color around. And this is sort of just a messy coloring, which is, I think, great for watercolor, because it just kind of lends itself to watercoloring. And if you look at the flower, the large flower to the left there, I even left some areas white. And I don't mind that at all. And I didn't even color in the leaves. So this is very partial coloring. And with the sentiment that I stamped, just like with the stamped image, because this is going onto such a heavily textured paper, I did have to stamp it multiple times to really make sure that the entire sentiment was legible. And that's pretty much it. and I'll go ahead and glue that panel down, and that's going to be my first flat card. So really, really lovely. Look at all that texture. You can see the horizontal stripes. That's coming from the texture of the watercolor paper. So now with my second flat card, and if you're new to my flip videos, I define a flat card not strictly just your card base, but at most one additional layer of cardstock on top of your card base, and then flat embellishments, if any at all. So maybe some sequins or confetti, but not big, gemstones or drops. So with my embossed panel, and I am using the 3D embossing folder, which is a new club that was introduced this year. I have embossed a panel. So I like to emboss first and then see what size I want to trim it down to. So the panel started off as USA 2 in size, but I did trim it just a smidge. I took 1/8 of an inch off the top and the bottom. And you may find, in fact, that after you've run your panel through your embossing folder, that it, I don't want to say shrink, but it may seem like it shrinks because of all of that dimension that is added. So that cardstock has to go somewhere. And so, because you have some areas that are raised, and that's what's giving you that embossed look. And what I'm doing is I'm just taking a sponge dauber, and I am just grazing sort of the top of the design with some ink, so that my ink just picks up just the top layers. And so I switched from my domed sponge dauber to my flatter stencil brush, because the flatter it is, I think the less likely you're going to get ink on the lower portions of the design. So the portions that are a little bit more recessed. The difference between a 3D embossing folder and a standard embossing folder is that with the 3D folders, it's you kind of have multiple levels of that embossed design. So not everything is raised to the same level. There's some things that are a little bit flatter, a little bit closer to the panel, and then some areas that are a little bit more raised. So you can see in the flowers where it's picking up a lot of ink along the edges, those areas are more raised than the others, because they're picking up a lot of the ink, where the brush can't really, if you're being careful to just graze the tops, your ink won't actually reach the more recessed areas, because the raised design is picking up the ink instead. And so that's sort of the difference. With an original embossing folder, everything is embossed or raised to the same level. You don't get multiple dimensions. And by having the multiple dimensions, some things that maybe aren't as raised as other areas of the design look like they're a little bit further back in the distance, or they look like they might be behind other areas or elements in the design. And so that's why it's called a 3D embossing folder, because it does have that illusion. And you do get a lot of really amazing realism. Especially look at those flowers. They just look fantastic, because there's some actual kind of curvature to them. It's not just that they're all raised to the same level like a 2D embossing folder would be. And so that, with the sentiment in the center there, that pretty much wraps up my second flat card. So now onto my layered card, and I'm gonna work again with the same 3D embossing folder. And these folders are the same size as the regular embossing folder club, so 5.5 wide by 8.5 tall. And it's fantastic to have a large folder like this, because you can be selective with where you want to pick up the embossed pattern, especially if you are just embossing a smaller panel like I am. And I start off by embossing this pink panel, but I'm actually going to change my mind midway through, and I actually won't use what I am embossing right now. But I did the exact same thing. Again, I just didn't bother recording, so because it's the same in principle, just a different color. What I'm gonna do is I'm actually going to fussy cut around this embossed design here and have a nice little kind of a shaped border. The fussy cutting around an embossed design is actually pretty easy because there's sort of this ridge almost that you can cut against. So it's actually a lot easier than I expected. And I went ahead and in some areas I just snipped some elements off. There was a flower in the center there. I just decided to snip that off. There was a leaf behind that petal there, and I decided to snip that off as well. So you can be selective about where you want to kind of end your design. But that's why I didn't bother embossing a full panel, because I knew I just wanted this shaped border. And so what I'm going to set up next is I'm going to take one of the debossing sentiment plates from the small die of the month. There were, I think, I don't have it in front of me, but I want to say there were 3 pairs of sentiments. So I say pairs because the small die of the month, which you'll see me craft with in a little bit, has a really large fancy ampersand. And the way the sentiments are designed is that you can leverage that ampersand. So there's a phrase before and after the ampersand. And for the most part, I believe all of the phrases before the ampersand, they make sense on their own. You don't necessarily have to use the second half of that, what would normally follow the ampersand. And so I've just taken one of those. So this one I think reads, "You are my forever." And it's a great sentiment for maybe a Valentine's Day card, which is coming up. An anniversary card would be really wonderful with this too. Or, the birthday of a significant other. And so really fantastic. You can use this for multiple different occasions. With a debossing sentiment plate, all it's doing is depressing the letters into your cardstock. So it doesn't cut anything out. It just pushes the lettering into your cardstock. And so what I'm going to do is actually fill up pretty much an entire panel with just that same sentiment repeated over and over again. It did take some time because each line was anywhere from 2 to 3 passes to deboss that sentiment going across. And there were a lot of lines. I didn't have to actually deboss the entire panel because I knew that at the bottom, I'm going to cover it up with the embossed border design that I fussy cut out. But it still took a little bit of time. But I think it's worth it. And one of the reasons why I sort of shifted gears a little bit is because I was thinking back to the last Crafty Fun with Friends episode where my friends and I played a new game that we came up with. Actually, Delise came up with it. It's a little bit of a twist on Craft Roulette. And one of the twists was that for 2 of the parameters, we let the folks who were joining us live in the chat suggest options for color. Was one of them, one of the parameters. And one of the suggestions was to make an all white card. And thankfully that one didn't get picked. but it got me thinking as I was partially through this card that how would I make a card that's all white? And so if you can't use color, then texture would be, my next inclination. And so 3D embossing folders, I think, are fabulous for adding that texture. And then with the debossing plate, by just debossing that sentiment across the entire panel and tiling, that panel with it, it's another bit of texture. So even though this is just white on white, there's actually no part of this card that isn't textured, because you've got that lovely texture of the embossed panel, which I just put some low profile foam behind. It's my 1mm thick foam, which I love working with. Just gives it a little bit of extra lift and dimension. And that's why this is technically layered, because I do have 2 layers. And so you'll get a close-up look of that one at the end, and on my social media pages as well. So now moving on to my interactive card. So here you see the small die of the month, and so there you can see the various debossing plates, and besides the debossing plates, there are several dies that will cut out different lengths of basically, sentiment strips. So you could use those to just cut out different widths of strips and then stamp in them, but you can also run them through your die cutting machine with the debossing sentiment plate and get a really lovely sentiment strip as well. And today's interactive card is going to be a shaker card. So I've die cut that large ornate ampersand right into a panel that I actually trimmed this down to 4 1/8 by 5 3/4 or 3/8. And I'm going to just line the back of this panel behind the ampersand that's been cut out with some clear acetate. And then I'll go ahead and add some foam all the way around, basically, so that I have an enclosed area where my shaker bits can move around in. And so one thing with the ampersand is you could try to get foam everywhere that there's cardstock, but I don't think that's going to give enough room for the shaker bits to move around. So I'm just going to end up making a rather large sort of square around, or rectangle around, that ampersand, and that's going to give the shaker bits plenty of space to kind of move around. And also it means that I don't have to worry about finding little itty bitty bits or trying to get foam in all of those curvy areas in between the ampersand. So before I finish my shaker element, I'm gonna run, just as I mentioned, the debossing plates along with the die that will cut out the sentiment strip. So I'll have those ready, and this card's gonna come together pretty quickly because shaker cards are wonderful in that way. The key, though, is that you do want to make sure that when you are applying your foam, that it's completely enclosed wherever you plan to put your shaker bits, that you have surrounded that area completely with foam. Because if you leave a gap, if you leave an opening, then your shaker bits might escape. And so you don't want that. And I've just pulled out some, I think they're from diamond press kits that I've had. So I'm just cutting these down to size and being very generous with lining this up, just so that I don't have any kind of saggy areas. But you do have to keep in mind, like I mentioned, that you want to make sure that all areas of this panel here are enclosed with foam. So anywhere where the cutout is, I just want to make sure that there's foam completely sort of encasing that area. And there's a bit of an opening at the top that I was worried about, and so that's why I added, or this bit to the side as well. That's a big opening that I knew I had to close up. But there's another little smaller area at the top where I didn't butt up my foam pieces, so there's a bit of a gap. And I just wanted to really make sure that nothing escapes out of there, so that's why I added another little square of foam to the top there. You'll see me do that in a moment when I finally spot it. So that's the biggest key to this, is just to really make sure you've got your everything completely enclosed. And so that's where I close off that little area there. And in retrospect, I wish I had actually filled this up a little bit more with shaker film. That's really the hardest part for me, knowing how much to fill up my shaker well. I think in the end it turned out okay, but I think it could have benefited from more. The challenge with putting too much is that it may actually be too full, and then it won't move around quite as much. But I love having the gold sequins move around against the black background. And this is going to, again, be another card that is pretty, clean and simple. And so I'm keeping everything very, very light on color. So really just gold, white, and black. So being very minimalistic with this one. And you'll see in my last card, my pop-up card, it's kind of the opposite. And it's going to be the most colorful card out of the set. Because I think pretty much for every card so far, I've had a pretty minimal color palette. Everything has been fairly monochromatic. And so we'll have our burst of color with my final card. So there's a look at my interactive card. And then now finally my pop-up card. So this card is actually a tuxedo pop-up card, and there's lots of different ways to make a tuxedo pop-up card. I'm gonna start with a piece that I'm cutting down to 11 inches by 4 1/4. And then along that 11-inch edge, I'm going to score it at 2 5/8, 7 or 5 1/4, 7 7/8, and then 10 1/2. On my scoreboard, I have to actually flip it around and score from the other end. But basically what you're scoring for is 4 sections that are 2 5/8 of an inch wide, and then a 1/2 inch glue tab. So that's essentially what we've created. And on that 1/2 inch glue tab, I've mitered the corners a little bit so that when that gets attached, we get a nice clean edge. Before I actually fold anything along the 5 1/4 inch score line, I'm gonna cut down from the top 1 1/2 inches. So you could do this, you could make a pencil mark at the 1 1/2 inch mark. My trimmer actually has a ruler along the side there. So, and my the cutting tool is actually marked also, so I know exactly where it's cutting, and so I don't actually have to worry about putting a pencil mark. I can just use the ruler. And then what you want to do is you want to score from the bottom of that cut to the top of the 2 score lines that are on either side of this cut. So you basically want to connect the bottom of this cut to your 2 5/8 score line and to your 7 7/8 score line. And that's going to give you this V score line. And you will have that's going to be the front of our tuxedo card. So now we can actually fold everything. So all of the first set of score lines will be mountain folds. And then the 2 diagonal score lines that we made at the end there, those would be valley folds. And so as part of our tuxedo, those are going to be basically the kind of the collar of the shirt. And the glue tab is going to be on the outside back of the card. So that's our card base. Now let's assemble some flowers from the large die of the month. And you can see these, you get such an array, such a large assortment of flowers, leaves, stems, lots and lots of different designs. I didn't even use everything, but I did try to cut out an assortment of different flowers, different sizes of flowers, and I used purples and pinks. So 3 shades of purples. These are all Spellbinders cardstock. So they're all really, really lovely 100-pound weight. These flowers are fantastic. You can layer them up to get a lot of different dimension, especially when you die cut them out of different colored cardstock. And I'm using, I used a bone folder to give this a little bit of curvature, and then I'm going to use some 3D glue gel to, again, give a little bit of curvature and dimension to this. And that glue gel will just kind of hold that dimension. And the great thing about how, especially the flowers like that one that get layered, you'll see some deboss lines that will give you a clue as to where to line up the additional layers that go on top of it. And all of the flowers do have these smaller dies. You can actually see them on the plate there that you can die cut to be the centers of your flowers. But instead, I just decided I'd rather use some drops, some Nuvo drops. So I'm going to use some Dream Drops. And Dream Drops are great because they have a bit of an iridescent finish. So I thought that would be really, really fun. And so I'm going to stick to my palette of sort of pinks and purples. And for a lot of these smaller flowers, I'm going to use the drops. And even for one of the large flowers, I haven't normally done this, but I decided to go for it. This one right here. I made a really huge Nuvo drop. And I'm used to making kind of smallish drops, but I thought that it would be fun to just be consistent with that. So okay, so now I'll let those drops dry, and I've set them aside, and now I'll go ahead and line my my tuxedo box here with some pattern papers. So for the back of the box, this is the back inside, and you don't necessarily have to put pattern paper on all 4 inside edges because you're mostly only going to see the 2 back edges. So I've cut these pieces to 2.5 inches wide by 4 1/8 inch tall. So it gives us a very, very slim margin where you can see the card base all the way around. And so those are going on the inside back pieces. I'm putting some double-sided adhesive tape on our glue tab, and that's going to get glued to the outside. That way you don't see that glue tab on the inside of your card or your box when you're looking at it. So this piece of pattern paper here has also been cut originally to 2.5 by 4 1/8, but then I just measured down. I'll show you how I do that. So this is where the original size, I just put a little pencil mark it's about 1.5 inches down, and I'll go ahead and slice off a triangle here. So from the pencil mark to the top corner, you just want to make sure when you're making these cuts that you have two pieces that are mirrored, so that they go on the left and the right front panels. And that way, you can see there that your color can fold down over it and you get a really nice finish there. This piece here has, again, we have to make some diagonal cuts and they do need to be mirrored. So this is 2.5 inches wide by 1 3/8 of an inch tall. And I've just cut those in half, but I've made the diagonal cut in opposite directions so that we do get a mirrored design here. And the other two triangles that you don't use, you can use on the second card if you want. So you can keep those and just make more of this style of card if you want. And I took the same pattern paper that is the inside of my box and I used that for the color. This piece here, these are just 1/2 inch strips. One has been cut to 5 inches wide and I've just scored and folded 1/2 inch on both sides. And the other one I cut to 4 inches wide and did the same thing, just cut scored and folded 1/2 inch on both sides as glue tabs. And that gives you these curved bridge pieces where you can stick your acetate stands to create the pop-up feature. And of course I like to attach everything when it's nice and flat. But when I attached my glue tab, and you'll have to be mindful of this because it just depends on how you score and fold. And this glue is so strong. The double-sided adhesive tape that I use, it's not even score tape brand, but it is really strong. And then combined with the fact that I put a little bit of liquid adhesive, I got to this pretty quickly, and yet it's still a little bit of work to pull that up. But what I was saying was that you have to be a little bit careful that this card will fold down completely. And because this one panel, it does have to actually fit inside a score line, a fold, you may need to trim or slice a little bit off. So I'm just taking little slivers, just a fly's eyelash off at a time, and making sure that when this panel is folded down, it folds inside of that score line. And that way the card can actually fold down completely. And I've made this a couple times. Sometimes you don't need to trim anything off, and sometimes you do. So it really just depends on where your score lines are and how it folds. Because sometimes it'll fold a little bit more towards one end or the other. And so it's a good little double check just to make sure that when this opens up, that the edge of that panel doesn't actually cross over the score line there at that back most corner, because otherwise you won't be able to fully open up your card. Okay, so now the fun part of arranging our florals. So I've just cut a bunch of acetate 1/2 inch stands, and I'm putting nice strong score tape at the bottom. You could use something like a red line tape too if you want. And I decided I wanted a third bridge piece so that I have basically 3 layers or 3 kind of dimensions to work with. And the nice thing about making your bridge pieces like this is that with it being curved like that, everything is just a little bit more forward facing. Whereas if you think of your your more standard pop-up box where the bridge is going from one side to directly across, the box to the panel opposite it. And when you have bridge pieces that are basically orthogonal to the sides of your box, whatever you attach to those bridge pieces are going to face that way as well. And they too will be orthogonal to one of the sides of the box. So with these curved bridge pieces, instead, everything that I'm attaching to it is, it's just going to be turned in a little bit more front and center. And so it's a nice effect, especially because this particular style of pop-up box is meant to be viewed from an angle like that, where basically one of the corners of the boxes is actually the front of the design. And so that curvature really helps everything kind of look a little bit more natural when you put it on display, and you can actually see everything a little bit better. So I'm just having a play at arranging all of these different elements, and my approach to this is I like to start with my large flowers first to really make sure that there's room for them, and that they are spaced color-wise where I want the eyes to be moving. So I try to make sure that the same colors are kind of spanning, front to back and left to right. That way, if your eyes are drawn to a particular color, and that's how your eyes are kind of bouncing around the composition, and that as it travels from that same color all the way throughout, it's moving your eyes, all the way left and right, front to back. And so that's my thinking behind how I'm choosing to place, or, where I'm choosing to place things. And there's that one flower that I know I'm pretty sure it's not baby's breath, but I kind of treat it as if it was. And I actually snipped into it a little bit here and there, just to use it as fill. In the same way that you would see a flower bouquet that you buy, at the store or the flower market. A lot of the things like the greenery and smaller flowers like baby's breath, they're used to kind of fill in, the space between your main focal point flowers. And so that's basically what I'm doing with all of these smaller flowers, with the leaves, with I don't know the name of that. I don't know if it's a flower or if it's just some foliage, but I love it. I die cut it out of some white because I knew I would be treating it like a baby's breath. And so that was my thinking, and I actually did end up using most, if not everything, that I die cut out. And I thought I was being generous and would have some leftovers possibly for a second card, but it does take quite a lot to to fill this in, especially since I added the third bridge piece, so that I have a lot more dimension and can put things sort of in that foreground, the midground, and the background. And so I'm just looking for spaces to sort of tuck these stray little flowers and leaves here and there. And I love that I had the one little flower left over, so I put that on the lapel of the shirt, almost like it was, a flower that, like a groomsman would have like a flower in there. And so I've got one of the sentiments, happy birthday. This was a debossing plate from the small die of the month, and I've put that across the bottom of my card here. And that's going to basically finish up my pop-up card, because I was having a hard time getting this to stick because of the dimension on the back. So I did use a little bit of my low profile foam to really get that stuck on. But look at that. What a fun card. So that is my tuxedo pop-up card. Nice, bright, multicolored card. And here's a final recap of all 5 cards that I made. So here's that first one featuring the clear stamp of the month, where I just did some messy watercoloring in a very monochromatic piece there. Here is another flat card where I used the 3D embossing folder and stamped my sentiment right in the center and did some inking to really pick up that 3D embossed pattern. And this is my layered card where I used the 3D embossing folder and fussy cut around it to get a shaped border, and repeat debossed stamped the sentiment. My interactive card was a shaker card that features the small die of the month, and my final card is my tuxedo pop-up card that features the large die of the month. Thanks so much for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have a favorite card, let me know in the comments below. Thanks again. Until next time, happy crafting and have a fantastic day. Bye.